Imagine a place that didn't exist 500 years ago, not on any map, not in any empire's imagination, and yet today it shapes the fate of the entire world. This is the story of America, not just a country, an experiment, one that nearly failed a dozen times before it ever truly began. Before there were highways or skyscrapers, before there were flags or constitutions, there was a continent, ancient, vast, and alive. For at least 15,000 years, indigenous peoples had built civilizations across this land. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy of the Northeast, the Mound Builders of the Mississippi Valley, the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, the Cherokee of the Appalachian Hills. These were not scattered tribes wandering empty wilderness. They were nations, sophisticated, governed, deeply rooted. When European ships first appeared on the horizon, they were not arriving at an empty stage. They were crashing into a world already full. Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, and within a generation, the consequences were catastrophic. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, swept through indigenous populations who had no immunity. Historians estimate that in the decades following first contact, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the native population of the Americas perished. It remains one of the most devastating demographic collapses in all of human history. The continent that Europeans called new had, in truth, been emptied by a silent catastrophe they barely noticed. Into that emptied space, empires rushed. The Spanish claimed the south, the French moved through the north, and the English, slower to the race, eventually planted their flags along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, a small band of English settlers arrived at a tidal swamp in present-day Virginia and built a fort they called Jamestown. They were underprepared, misdirected, and desperate. Within the first year, disease and starvation killed more than half of them. The survivors clung to life through a combination of stubbornness, indigenous assistance, and sheer luck. It was a fragile start. Nobody watching would have predicted that this miserable little outpost would be the seed of a superpower. But the English kept coming. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, the Pilgrims, crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Before they even stepped ashore, they drew up a document, the Mayflower Compact, a simple agreement among themselves to govern by the consent of the governed. It was a small moment, easy to overlook, but embedded in that compact was an idea that would one day reshape the world. The idea that governments derived their power from the people, not from kings. By the mid-1700s, 13 distinct British colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard. They were not a nation, they were a patchwork, different religions, different economies, different personalities. The southern colonies depended on the labor of enslaved Africans to produce tobacco and rice. The northern colonies thrived on trade and shipbuilding. There was no single American identity yet, but there was a growing irritation, and irritation, given enough time, has a way of becoming revolution. Britain had just fought a long and expensive war against France, the 7 Years' War, and decided the colonies should help pay for it. New taxes arrived, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. To the colonists, these taxes felt like punishment. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no voice in the decisions being made about their lives. And so they said the words that would echo for centuries: no taxation without representation. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the water. It was a theatrical act of defiance. Britain responded with crackdowns, and what had been a political argument began sliding towards something far more dangerous. The tension broke at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, when colonial militiamen stood their ground against British troops. Nobody is entirely sure who fired first. History remembers it as the shot heard round the world.
The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years.
It was not a clean or heroic conflict. George Washington's Continental Army was perpetually undersupplied, underpaid, and on the edge of collapse. In the brutal winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, soldiers wrapped their feet in rags. Men died not from British bullets, but from cold and disease. Washington himself kept the army together through a combination of moral authority and sheer will. It was not certain they would win. In fact, for most of the war, it looked like they wouldn't. What changed everything was France. In 1778, France formally allied with the American cause, not out of love for democracy, but out of a desire to weaken its ancient rival, Britain. French troops, French money, and crucially, the French Navy tipped the balance. At Yorktown, Virginia, in October of 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. The war was effectively over. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris made it official. 13 former colonies were now a sovereign nation. But what kind of nation? That question nearly tore everything apart before it began. The Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at a national government, gave almost all power to the individual states and almost none to the center. The result was chaos. The national government couldn't collect taxes, couldn't enforce laws, couldn't even pay its own soldiers. In 1786, a rebellion of indebted Massachusetts farmers, Shays' Rebellion, marched on a federal arsenal, and the national government was powerless to stop them. The experiment was failing. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, secretly with windows nailed shut in the summer heat, to fix the problem. What they produced was the United States Constitution. It was a masterwork of compromise. Large states and small states fought over representation, northern delegates and southern delegates clashed over slavery, and in a moral failure that would haunt the nation for generations, they compromised with it, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, while leaving the institution itself intact. The men in that room knew it was a contradiction. Some of them agonized over it, but they chose the Union over justice and deferred a reckoning that would eventually arrive in blood. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. George Washington became the first president, and the great experiment began, carefully, imperfectly, aware of its own fragility. The early republic expanded rapidly. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, negotiated by President Thomas Jefferson, doubled the size of the nation overnight. Lewis and Clark set out to map what had just been bought. The continent stretched toward a horizon that seemed to have no end. And with expansion came a dark engine, the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The Trail of Tears in the 1830s, in which the Cherokee and other nations were forcibly marched hundreds of miles to territory west of the Mississippi, killed thousands. America was growing, but the cost of that growth was paid by those who had been there first. By the mid-1800s, the contradiction buried in the Constitution had grown into a national crisis. Slavery was not fading, it was expanding, spreading into new territories, defended with increasing aggression by Southern politicians. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1660, a man who opposed slavery's expansion, was the breaking point. 7 Southern states seceded before he even took office. 4 more followed. The nation that had been born in revolution was now tearing itself in half. The Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history, more than 600,000 soldiers dead and an uncounted toll of civilian suffering. The Union Army's early losses gave way eventually to industrial superiority and the leadership of generals like Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln, in January of 1863, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free.
It was a war measure as much as a moral declaration, but its meaning reached far beyond the battlefield. 4 million enslaved people had their status transformed by a single document. The question was what freedom would actually look like. The answer during the Reconstruction era was deeply complicated. For a brief and remarkable period, Black Americans voted, held office, built schools, and shaped policy. Then, through a combination of political deal-making, violence, and the withdrawal of federal protection, those gains were systematically dismantled. Jim Crow laws imposed legal segregation across the South. The promise of Reconstruction was betrayed. The struggle for true equality had barely begun. Meanwhile, the nation industrialized at a speed the world had never seen. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel mills roared in Pittsburgh. Oil derricks rose in Pennsylvania. Immigrants arrived in millions from Ireland and Italy, from Poland and China, from Mexico and Eastern Europe, drawn to the promise of wages and a new life. By 1900, the United States was the largest industrial economy on Earth. Fortunes were made on a scale that made European aristocracies look modest. And in the shadows of those fortunes, workers toiled in dangerous conditions for wages that kept them perpetually poor. The tension between wealth and labor would simmer for decades. The 20th century arrived like a wave. America entered the First World War in 1917, late, decisive, and forever changed by it. In the 1920s, prosperity roared, cities sparkled, jazz filled the air, and then in October of 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression descended like a curtain. Banks failed, farms dried up, and millions of Americans stood in bread lines, wondering how the richest country in the world had suddenly run out of everything. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal reshaped the relationship between government and citizen, establishing a federal safety net that endures to this day.
Out of the Depression came war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, pulled a reluctant America into the Second World War. 16 million Americans served. Factories that had built cars now built bombers. Women entered the workforce in numbers never seen before. And in a chapter of profound national shame, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to internment camps, citizens imprisoned by their own government out of fear and prejudice. America was capable of both heroism and cruelty, sometimes simultaneously. The war ended with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, a decision that remains one of the most debated in history. The world had never seen destruction of that scale delivered so efficiently. The United States emerged from the war as the dominant global power, its homeland untouched, while Europe and Asia lay in ruins. It was a position of extraordinary advantage, and with it came extraordinary responsibility and a new kind of competition. The Cold War with the Soviet Union defined the next 4 decades. It was a confrontation of ideologies as much as armies, democracy versus communism, capitalism versus state control. It was fought in proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, in the space race above the atmosphere, and in the quiet terror of nuclear standoff. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than any moment before or since. 13 days in which 2 superpowers stared at each other across an abyss. Neither blinked. At home, America was transforming itself again. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and Martin Luther King Jr., challenged the nation to live up to the ideals it had always claimed. Through nonviolent protest, legal strategy, and extraordinary courage in the face of violence, the movement produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was the second Reconstruction, more durable than the first,
though the work it began remained unfinished. The late 20th century brought the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a stunning, largely peaceful implosion that left the United States as the world's sole superpower. For a moment, it seemed as though history itself might be winding down toward a peaceful conclusion. It wasn't. The attacks of September 11, 2001 shattered that assumption. Nearly 3,000 people died in a single morning. 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq followed. The financial crisis of 2008 shook the global economy to its foundations. And through the first decades of the 21st century, America grappled with questions about inequality, identity, technology, and democracy itself, questions that have no simple answers and no single resolution. Which brings us to the most important thing about this story. America was never finished. It was never meant to be. The founders, brilliant, flawed, contradictory, designed a system intended to evolve, a living document, a continuing argument. Every generation has inherited a country in progress and has had to decide what to do with it. Every generation has fallen short in some ways and reached further than its predecessors in others. What makes America singular is not that it has always done the right thing. It hasn't. Its history is scarred with injustice, broken promises, and moral failure. What makes it remarkable is something different, the insistence, generation after generation, that the ideals are real, that they matter, and the willingness of ordinary people to hold the country accountable to them. The enslaved man who ran for freedom, the suffragist who refused to sit down, the immigrant who crossed an ocean on a whisper of hope, the soldier who doubted but served anyway, the citizen who voted, wrote, marched, or simply refused to look away. The story of America is not the story of a perfect nation. It is the story of an imperfect one that keeps reaching, sometimes falling back, sometimes surging forward towards something it has not yet fully become. And that, more than any battle or law or discovery, is what makes it one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the world.